think I was about 10 years old when Paul Simon penned those now almost immortal words, "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again. Because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping, and the vision that was planted in my brain still remains with the sound of silence." Some of you are singing it. Maybe we should, but I couldn't be the one to lead you. You know, I find myself strangely drawn to the figures in the Old Testament story and in the gospel reading today. Those main characters in those passages, Elijah in the Old Testament, and let's call him Legion, though I'm sure that's not his right name, but that's the only name we have for him. Otherwise, he's nameless. Elijah's one of those key personages in the whole of the Hebrew Bible, isn't he? In fact, the whole Bible, you see Elijah cropping up. We saw him on the Mount of Transfiguration, and in Malachi talks about it. One like Elijah is going to come back, and people thought that might have been John the Baptist. And you know that Elijah theme runs through the Bible. He's a kind of a big shot in the Bible. And in fact, in chapter 17 and 18 of that, right before chapter 19, where we read today, you know, his work is sort of over the top. I mean, he's the man in those chapters. He really is. He's confronting kings, and he's confronting the prophets of Baal, and he's performing miracles, and he's raising the dead, and he's calling down fire from heaven to wash up sacrifices that have been doused with a trench of water around them. This is no small stuff. This is big God. This is big prophet. You know, it's not silence. But now in chapter 19, that bigger-than-life personage of Elijah is cowering in fear, and he's fleeing at the threat of Queen Jezebel, and he's filled with self-doubt, and he's overcome with discouragement, and he's actually pleading, he's praying. Notice it's a prayer to die. Call him bipolar if you like. I don't think so. Because I think some of us find ourselves in that kind of silence also. Legion, the man from the Gerasene area, I refuse to call him what the editorial heading is in my Bible, because it says the Gerasene demoniac, as though his identity were a demoniac. No, he's a man who happens to struggle and be possessed by these demons in his life. There's a difference, by the way. Think about that when we talk about people who, well, like you and me, struggle with stuff. We don't want to be named and branded by those, but that's not a part of what I want to say today, except I just said it, so there you go. Maybe I did. He's overtaken with these demonic forces. He's unable to restrain himself, and he's unable to remain restrained when others try to restrain him. He breaks away. Any shackles, any bonds that can be placed on him are broken apart. He's unclothed, and he is abandoned, and he's homeless, and he's living among the tombs, among the dead. He's unclean, he's unstable, he's unsafe, he's unapproachable. He lives in a kind of silence. Both of them are experiencing the deafening sound of silence in their own lives, internally and externally. For Elijah, it was the silence of extreme discouragement and dejection and depletion and fatigue. Some of you in this room are therapists and know these things far better than I. But you can see them there. They almost jump off the page, the classic signs of deep melancholy and depression. Sleeping a lot. He needs to be told to eat. His view of reality is distorted. He feels all alone. he has suicidal ideation. He's in a bad place. For Legion, it was the silence of it was internal disintegration. He was being torn apart, pulled apart by the fighting that was within him. And it was wholesale social isolation. He had no one anymore. There was not a home. They were simply the places where the dead were buried. Their lives, both of them, were at the lowest possible place. And yet somehow in both the Old Testament and in the gospel story, somehow both were able to find God in the silence of their lives. For Elijah, it came through this sort of grace-filled revelation that God was not only to be found in the dramatic and the powerful. Sometimes God is, right? Sometimes God is about those things, like chapter 17 and 18 of 1 Kings. But sometimes not. God's not only in the dramatic and the powerful and the worked up. God is not only in the wind and the earthquake and the fire, but also and perhaps most often in the sound of sheer silence. Maybe it's appropriate that we're starting in earnest, ordinary time, in which we will be, friends, all the way up until Advent. Brace yourselves for the drone of the mundane and the ordinary. That's the way most of the church year is. Oh, wait, no. It's not the church year. It's life. Most of life isn't on the mountaintop or in the valley, thank God. It's in the drone of the ordinary. It's sort of in the silence. Nothing big, nothing terribly bad. It's there. And God shows up there also. Now, one advantage of having a first service and a second service is you get to practice on the first people. And Dave Brown came up to me and said, we were in a church one time, and the pastor was quoting a commentator whom I cannot remember. Somebody in the room may know, but I don't. He said, someone paraphrases that sound of sheer silence as a silence so profound it spoke. That's good. A silence so profound that it spoke. That God is somehow present even in the midst of, not somehow, but unfailingly present even in the midst of the ordinary. That there's goodness in the mundane and the plain, in the settled keeping power of the calm after the storm. Don't you love the calm after the storm? It's a beautiful thing. For Legion, it was a living encounter with someone who actually cared enough to want to know his name. People who live like that, and some of our attendees at church live on the streets, and I'm thankful for that. Some of them we know their names, and some of them we don't. I can tell you this. Their heart is turned when you ask them their name. And for Legion, he found God in the sound of silence because somebody said, "What is your name? What is your name?" And of course, we still don't know his name because it was the demons who ended up speaking. This 10,000, this legion there's a legion of soldiers within me, and they're demonic, and they're tearing my life apart. My name is Legion. Perhaps these stories may serve as a guide for us when we find ourselves in those kinds of places. None of our stories will be exactly the same, but there'll be enough connection, perhaps, between Elijah and Legion that we can find ourselves in there somewhere, and certainly they might be some help for us when we have the honor and privilege of helping a friend or a family member who is being crushed by the sound of silence. Elijah found the silence in several ways that we could sort of enumerate very quickly here. One of them was that he found God in the silence by being honest with himself. I don't know if you noticed those verses in 1 Kings, beginning in verses 2 and 3. It says, then he was afraid. He was self-aware enough to know that he was afraid, and he fled because of fear. You know, it's not a bad question to ask yourself every now and then, what am I afraid of? What am I afraid of? I'm afraid of being found out. I'm being afraid of, and fill in the blank. He was afraid. He felt like a failure. Verse 4, he confesses, I'm no better than my ancestors. And here I thought I was the man. I thought I was going to do something different. I'm no better than my ancestors. I'm a failure. There's no reason for me to be alive. Everything I've done amounts to nothing. And he actually prays to die. He was afraid, he felt like a failure, and he wanted to die. Well, I don't like any of those things, but at least he was honest. And honesty with oneself is a huge step forward of the possibility of hearing a silence so profound that it may actually speak to you. Elijah found God in the silence by being willing to listen to the voice of another and to receive the care of another. That story goes on that says that a messenger came along. The NRSV translates that as angel, but the word there is simply messenger. And you don't know until the next verse when the angel asks him to eat again that it's the messenger of the Lord. Therefore, it's an angel. And Elijah didn't know this was an angel. He simply knew that it was a messenger who came, get up and eat. This would be good for you to get up and eat. And he listened. And he listened. That was a turning point in coming to be able to hear God in the silence for him. He began simply by following the direction to take care of himself. He got up and ate. And in getting up and eating, he began probably a little inkling to realize that somebody, I don't know who this is, but somebody who actually cares for me and is interested in what's going on. And this someone, this messenger, did you notice that this messenger didn't shake him awake and say, get up and go back there? No. This one got him to get up and eat and let him go back to bed. And he went back to sleep. He slept some more. We don't know how long he slept, but we do know it was long enough for the messenger now called the messenger of the Lord, the angel of the Lord, to come back and say, get up and eat. So maybe it was the time for the next meal. Maybe it was overnight. Maybe it was the rest of the day. It was long enough for that caring other to know that he needed to eat again. And he listened. He got up and ate, and on the strength of that eating, this other person who didn't deter him allowed him to go on and continue his journey, and he journeyed on the strength of that nourishment for 40 days and 40 nights. Pretty impressive. The friend didn't try to talk him out of his feelings. He simply tried to care for his being. And then Elijah found God in the sound of the silence by reconnecting with the foundational stories of his people and of his faith. It's fascinating that this passage, this Elijah story, is interwoven with all of these allusions to the Moses story. that they all sort of come together in this story with Elijah. And I don't have time to alliterate them all, but just a few of them. God confronts Elijah with a series of questions and commands like he did Moses. He's on a wilderness journey, in flight like Moses was. He does it for 40 days and 40 nights. God appears to Elijah on Mount Sinai, that is Mount Horeb, as named here, the place where Moses met God. He goes perhaps to the same cave where Moses saw the backside of the Lord. All these allusions sort of connect this together. All of these things are reaching back and helping him reconnect with the foundations of his people and of his faith. Notice that if you compare verse 10, his first declaration of what the problem is, and verse 14, his second declaration, it's verbatim. The problem really is the problem. It doesn't get changed. It's a real problem, and it needs to be dealt with. But now, by the end of this narrative, he's able to see the presence and goodness of God in the midst of those problems and in a fresh way. He was able to see that God is still on the move, that God is somehow working through history. Go and anoint these three people, because I'm still working in the world, even if you feel you don't see it. And even anoint Elisha, the one who will be your successor. My work is going on. God is on the move. And Elijah found God in the silence. Legion, very quickly. Legion found God in the silence, first of all, by recognizing and confessing his deepest need. The end of that first comment, as he came out and asked, "What have you have to do with me?" He said these words, "I beg you, do not torment me." Whatever you do to me, Jesus, don't torment me. Legion is a person, for how long back we do not know, but surely all of his adult life, who has known nothing but torment at the hands of internal demons and external people. He has no home, he has no community, he has no society, he is isolated. You know, something at the core of what it means to be human is the simple desire not to be tormented, but to be loved and to be cared for. And of course, in this interplay of a man who's dealing with demonic possession, you don't know who's talking. Is it the man or is it the demon? You see, because it's very clear here that even the demons don't want to be mistreated. Don't send us back into the abyss. As Chelsea Harmon so beautifully summarizes, even the evil forces hate the company of evil. And so Jesus, go figure, gives them permission to go into the pigs. Now, it didn't end up much different. They jumped off the cliff and sadly died. And, there's another sermon about the ecology of the pigs and so forth. But there you go. It's not today. You see, he needed to be cared for, and he confessed his need. And he found God in the silence by sitting at the feet of Jesus. He sat at the feet of Jesus as a newly born disciple. In the New Testament and in first century Judaism, what do you do when you follow a rabbi? The rabbi sits down and you sit around at his feet and you listen. And that is code language for him becoming a disciple of Jesus. He was clothed and in his right mind, the passage says. He was restored to a community of acceptance and caring and purpose. And then he found God in the silence by engaging in mission, simply sharing what Jesus had done for him. And notice that he even sort of just a little half step different than what Jesus told him to do. And I like him for that. Listen, follow me on this. You know, the man wants to go with Jesus. You know, if they're going to send you away, take me with you. But Jesus says, no, go home. Because the thing that he now had that he didn't have before was actually a home. And go and tell people, here's what Jesus said, go tell people what God has done. Jesus made it about theology. This is how God is. God does this in the world. The man sort of said, I sort of think Jesus is God. And I think he's right about that. But this text says very clearly, and the man went back home and began proclaiming what Jesus had done for him. It was personal. He didn't try to theologize this and make it a theology of casting out demons. He simply wanted to make it personal. This is what happened to me, and Jesus is the one who did it. He went proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him. There are three simple phrases that sort of help us apply, I think, this to our lives today. The first is from the Old Testament. Did you notice when Elijah heard that sheer silence? A silence so profound that it spoke. It says that Elijah got up and took his mantle, the sign of his calling and ministry as a prophet of God, and put it around his face and stood at the mouth of the cave. Interesting. Something's going on there. He's taking this calling of God and embracing it, maybe kissing it, saying, I think I can go forward. I think I can do this now. Because I see it in a different light. Circumstances haven't changed. It's all true. It's bad. But I see it in a different light. What might it mean for you and me to see life in a different light in those places of our lives? The phrase in the gospel story is this one. When the man says, "What have you, Jesus, to do with me?" What, if we were to say it for ourselves, what has Jesus to do with the forces and powers that occupy me? What has Jesus to do with the forces and powers that occupy your life and control your life, that keep you from experiencing the fullness that God created you for? What is it? See, I don't want to get into a theory of demons and spiritual warfare right now, but I believe there is spiritual warfare. We wrestle not against blood and flesh, but against the powers of this world. But the demonic clearly is at least this. The demonic is anything that influences our lives in ways that are counter to the wholeness God desires for his creatures. Because if there were no demonic, we would be in paradise. We would be in the new creation. The demonic is at least anything which influences our lives in ways that are counter to the wholeness that God desires for you and for all of creation. It's a good question to ask. And then finally, that sobering statement of the people who had their own kind of silence, but they're the ones in the story who never find a way out, who never hear the voice of God in the midst of that silence. It says, then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them, for they were seized with great fear. So Jesus got into the boat and returned. He left. They effectively silenced the physical presence and the voice of Jesus among them and sent him away. I wonder, do we ever do that now? I wonder if we do that because we're afraid of the disruption that the actual gospel might cause if it were truly embraced and practiced. Just 3 days ago, we celebrated Juneteenth. Apparently everywhere but the White House. I won't go there. Country celebrated Juneteenth. That day in 1865 in Texas, when in the aftermath of the Civil War, enslaved people who were actually free since the Emancipation Proclamation of 1862 finally heard that they were no longer slaves. I mean, why tell them? If you're going to keep working for us for virtually nothing. Because that, after all, would have an economic impact, sort of like pigs falling off a cliff. Or if we really took the gospel seriously, with Paul in Galatians, would we have any inequality between people anymore? For now there is no Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free, for all are one in Christ. Maybe there are ways that we too are still in the sound of silence. And we, like the people in Paul Simon's old poem, and the people bowed and prayed to the neon god they made. And the sign flashed out its warning and the words that it was forming. Then the sign said, "The words of the prophets are written on the subway walls by the homeless and in tenement halls and whispered in the sound of silence." Amen.